Have you ever stopped to think, what kind of camera would you take on a trip to the moon? Remember, this is 60 years ago when cameras weren't electronic. There were no iPhones or anything like that. Cameras were all mechanical and a lot of very fine precision mechanics, the kind of thing that doesn't take kindly to being shaken up in the vibrations of a rocket launch. So how do you make sure that you have good photographs to bring back? Think how disappointing it would be if you returned home and your friend said, "Come on, show us your photographs." And you had to say, "Well, actually, I didn't take any because the camera broke before I got there." So NASA had to make sure that they took very good quality cameras, and they chose as the camera supplier a little Swedish company called Hasselblad. Hasselblad at that time was a world leader, possibly the world leader, in very fine precision cameras, the kind of cameras that professionals use for things like surveying, architectural pictures, important wedding photographs, fashion shoots and things of that sort. And Hasselblad had been making these cameras for a great many years, established a very strong position. So Hasselblad cameras went to the moon. By the way, people say there are 11, some people say 12 cameras that didn't come back. They're still lying on the surface of the moon because the little lunar lander, which was used for the return journey, had a very tight weight limitation. And by the time the astronauts had loaded up all the rock samples they wanted to bring back, there was no room left for the cameras. So the cameras were all left behind. So there are these 11 or 12 Hasselblad cameras lying on the surface of the moon. I think it's the first recorded example of space fly tipping. So Hasselblad, 1960s, very strong in making these kind of high performance cameras. Fast forward 20 years, Hasselblad has a problem because competitors are starting to eat into their territory by introducing new cameras with electronic controls and the like, which were much more efficient and much less likely to suffer from being knocked and bumped than the Hasselblad mechanical cameras. What does Hasselblad do? It hires some consultants and it sits down to have conversations about what's our future, and there are lots of discussions about opportunities in cameras, and the talks get nowhere. It just goes round and round in circles. And then somebody says, wait a minute, Hasselblad's skills are actually in fine precision mechanics. We're looking at the wrong problem. We're asking what's its future in the camera business. We should be asking what's its future in fine mechanical engineering businesses. Intake of breath from the senior management of Hasselblad, conversation starts, and all of a sudden lots of fresh ideas come to the surface. And that's an example of reframing the problem in order to open up fresh ways of looking at it. It's an example of what I call creative thinking. It's a particular kind of creativity. It's what you might call useful creativity. And by that I mean useful in a business context. I'm sure we've all heard, maybe even played that little parlour game. Can you think of 100 uses for a paperclip? I mean, that's fun, but it's not particularly useful in a business sense, unless of course you happen to be a paperclip manufacturer. So that is really my first key learning point today, that creativity can be very valuable in a business sense. It's worth trying to build your creativity skills because they are important skills to have as an asset in your careers, in life in general. So that's learning point number one. Creativity is important. At this point, I suspect some of you are feeling a bit despondent and miserable because you're thinking to yourself, well, if creativity is important in business, that's me doomed because I'm not particularly creative. Let's just test that. I think the world divides into those who are really very creative and those who are not particularly creative. Hands up those who think they're in the very creative camp. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so there are some of you who are in the creative camp, which means that the majority are in the not very creative camp. And that's okay, that's fine, that's normal. Nothing to be ashamed of. And really it's to you that I'm addressing the rest of my remarks, because you might be thinking, well, that's me doomed. You'd be wrong, because creativity can be recreated. And let me just explore that a little bit. How many of you have ever watched children playing? 1, 2, 3, yes, good. You're getting used to this hands up business. Children are very creative. You give them a set of plastic bricks and they start building a throne or a castle. You give them a little rag doll and they create a talkative lifelong friend or a policeman or a monster. You give them a scruffy old cardboard box and before you know it, they've created a train or a space rocket. Children are enormously creative. And yet, by the time we reach our late teens, early 20s, most of you think you're not creative. So what happened to the creativity you were born with? Where did it all go wrong? There are theories about this. Some people argue that it's all the fault of the education system, because we're trained throughout our education to be sensible, to be logical, to grow up, all the sorts of things that in a way are the opposite of being creative and playful. So the challenge is, can we recreate in you that creativity that you were born with? That's my second key learning point. It is possible to recreate that initial creativity that you were born with. And I'm going to show you how, or give you some clues, some pointers at least. The first thing to do is to aim to be curious. That's a mantra that you should keep firmly in mind. Be curious. Develop your sense of curiosity. Because if you're curious about things around you, what you do over time is that you collect an enormous database, I could almost call it, of things you have seen, things you've learnt. And that is a tremendous resource. Because when you're faced with a problem, a creative mind says, you know what, I've seen something like that before. Yes, that was fixed in that way. Can I borrow something from that previous situation, repurpose it as a way of solving the challenge that I'm currently facing? And the more you have that rich library of experiences, the more likely you are to be able to find something that's helpful as a starting point for coming up with a solution. How do you build your curiosity? The first thing to really stress is to be out of your comfort zone as much as possible. If you only ever do the same old things over and over and over, you won't learn very much. Whereas the more you deliberately step out of your comfort zone, the more you are likely to have new experiences and build that library that is so important as an underpinning for creativity. So read a lot, read books, read articles, read magazines, particularly in subjects outside your own subject. It's not a waste of time, it's all about building the library. Travel, explore different cultures, explore different architectures, explore different ways that people work and think and live, particularly in a business context, so you know who you're dealing with when you're working in an international environment. Fill your library with these experiences. So that's an important part of learning to be curious. There are 3 little words which are very helpful. The first of which is how. Keep asking yourself how. How does something work? Let me give you an example. When I was a student, my then girlfriend complained that the 3-speed gear on her bicycle wasn't working, and I was overjoyed because it gave me an excuse to take it to bits to find out how it worked. How does one of these things work? Has anybody ever taken one of these to pieces? It's full of little cogs and wheels and springs and pawls and ratchets. It's a 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle of little bits and pieces. I took it to bits, fixed it, and eventually put it back together again. My girlfriend was overjoyed, and I learnt a lot. By the way, one of the things I learnt was never, ever, ever take one of these to pieces on your front lawn. Because what happens is all the little tiny cogs and springs and wheels, when you take the lid off, go pling, and then you spend the next 2 hours scrabbling in the grass looking for the little bits. So don't do what I did. But that's an example of what I mean. You're asking how. How does something work? Another key question is why. Why is the sky blue? Why do we use red for stop and green for go? What is it about those colours that mean that they mean stop and go? Why is the width between the railway lines 4 feet 8.5 inches? A very funny measure. When Brunel in the 19th century tried to advocate his broad gauge, his rails were 7 feet and 1/4 inch apart. Now 7 feet I can understand, it's a nice round number, but what's with the 1/4 inch? 7 feet and 1/4 inch is a very funny distance, I think. So asking why all the time. And the third question to ask is who? Who runs the internet, for example? So keep asking who questions. So how does something work? Why do we do things in a particular way? Who is involved in things? So build your library by asking questions. The second thing that you can do to boost your creativity is to pay attention to the sorts of articles and tips and tricks and techniques that you will find on the internet. There are loads of them. Just one or two that I've found particularly useful. Remember that it's about play. It's about recreating that sense of play you had when you were a child. And so one of the things that can be very important is to be relaxed. You've come across the idea that many firms, I'm sure you've read about, have relaxation areas, comfortable furnishings, bright colours, where people can just lounge about. It's not being idle. That's deliberately recreating that sense of play space to encourage creativity. And we do it in Royal Holloway. This is in the Schilling building on the Egham campus. It's where the electronic engineering department has its home. We call it the creative thinking room. And it's a nice bright light space with lots of bright colours, comfortable furnishings, even bean bags you can sit on. So no chairs like this, but just sort of comfortable lounging about seating. In this particular photograph, it's being used for a lecture. But for a lot of the time, it's used by groups of people or individuals trying to solve problems. It's where the PhD students go to wrestle with some problem that they have. It's where groups of undergrads who are trying to deal with an assignment will go to be creative, because it's a nice relaxing play space. So relaxation, that's dealing with the, if you like, the physical environment. But you also have to remember that there are other things that you need to pay attention to if you want to be creative. For example, can anybody tell me the solution to this puzzle? Surely somebody must be able to suggest it. Yes. Got it. Well done. Gold star. Everybody assumes that this is somebody from the inside looking out and falling 26 floors. But it's not. The person concerned is on the outside looking in. And when they jump into the building, they simply land on the carpet and they're fine. The point of this is we tend to make assumptions. And if you want to be creative, one of the good ways to be creative is to look at a challenge, to look at a problem and find out what are the assumptions that are built into it. Because very often those assumptions are leading you down blind alleys or blocking you from being creative. If you can understand what the assumptions are and challenge those assumptions, that can open up a whole lot of new thinking. It's a bit like the Hasselblad assumption that they were a camera business, where in fact they were a fine precision mechanical engineering business. And when somebody said, let's look at opportunities in that bigger business space, suddenly the conversation opened up. Yeah? All right, so this is dealing with the physical environment. But of course, another part of the environment is the psychological environment. we like to try to create an environment, don't we, in which people feel comfortable about coming forward with an idea. Let's say an R&D chap sitting in a product committee brainstorming meeting trying to come up with ideas for a new product. What you want to have happen is that this guy comes up with a bright idea. You want all your staff, if you're working in any kind of management position, you want your staff to feel able to come forward with bright ideas. Remember, this is dangerous because in most organizations there are people around you in the group who will do anything to try and push you down in order to build up their own position. Look at the expression on the face of this guy. Let's call him a marketing guy. It's not that I dislike marketing. If any of you in the room are marketing people, I'm not getting at you. But there's just a person in the room who is very suspicious of this person who's come up with the idea. So as a manager, you want to create an environment in which this guy is happy to come up with an idea. What you want to avoid is the situation where this guy, the marketing guy, is really reaching out and crushing the idea that's just been put on the table. What do you think this poor R&D guy feels like at this moment? Do you think he will ever dare to come forward with a bright idea in future? What do you think's happened to his sense of creativity? It's shriveled and crushed. Yes. So here's a lesson. If you want to be creative, and if as a manager you want your team to be creative, your task is to create this sort of atmosphere of being willing to be brave and come up with an idea. You want to avoid this sort of behaviour. And any of you who've ever studied the technique of brainstorming will know that one of the success factors for a good brainstorming session is to avoid the use of the word but. So when this guy comes up with an idea, you're not allowed, Mr. Marketing Guy, to say, but that will never work, or but that's too expensive, or but we tried it before and it didn't work last time. You never say but in a brainstorming. You always say and. Yes, I get your idea and I can build on it by proposing a way to do it at lower cost, or to do it in a different way from the way we did it last time. Yeah. So here are some thoughts about creativity. My first thought was that creativity is valuable. Secondly, it is possible to recreate your creativity. And thirdly, I've suggested a few ways in which you can help yourself and the people around you to be more creative. And I hope that's something which you can take away and find useful. And what of Hasselblad? Hasselblad is still there, it's still going, it's still making cameras and a lot of other things as well, including electronic cameras. It's currently owned by a Chinese company who make commercial drones for doing surveys of the land. And clearly having a high precision camera mounted in that drone would be very useful. That's why the Chinese company bought Hasselblad. So it's still there, it's still making cameras, and I like to think that back in the early 1980s, when that conversation around what business is it in took place, that was a way that helped Hasselblad to get over the threat that it faced at that time. I can tell the Hasselblad story because I was that rather naive green consultant who, in a boardroom in Sweden in 1983, told the bosses of the world's leading camera manufacturer that they weren't in the camera business. And I've gone on trying to be usefully creative ever since. And I hope that in sharing with you just a few of the things I've learned along the way will help you to be usefully creative in your careers as well. Thank you for listening.